What led you to focus on Milton Howard, your paternal great-grandfather?
Well, first, let me say it's a pleasure to be here, Donna, and I thank you so much for inviting me. Well, the backstory is I researched Milton Howard off and on most of my adult life. In 2013, I took a DNA test and began researching my family history almost every day since then. And the
Mhm.
more I researched, the more I realized that the act of researching was comforting to me. There was so much that I just did not know. My father, Glenn Perkins, was interviewed in 1977 by a Rock Island Arsenal, Rock Island, Illinois reporter. This published newsletter article included the story of my great grandfather, Milton Howard, without being very specific. For example, in this story, my father said Milton was enslaved by a planter named Pickett, but did not say which Pickett. It was then that I began on a quest to fill in the specifics about Milton Howard's life.
Thank you, Karen. And Anne, although you weren't actively doing family research genealogy, you were aware of your ancestry and some of the stories surrounding them. What was it that moved you or called you to begin looking into your family's history? And also to sort of uncover that box in your closet, which I hope you'll talk about, that your father had left you.
Yes, I was I was aware of A.J. Pickett as an historian. He was actually the first historian of Alabama. As
Mm.
far as his life as a planter and a slaveholder, I didn't. There's kind of knowing and knowing. I did not know that, although of course I could have known it.
Mhm.
Um, and I had inherited a box of family documents from my father, from his side of the family, his family in Alabama. And I just shoved it literally in my office closet behind some tax records or something. And it was just gonna stay there. But what really motivated me to open up those files and look into it was what was going on after the election with the kind of rise of white supremacy, and my understanding that many of these people revered the Confederacy. They felt the South did not actually lose. And there's a whole mythology called the Lost Cause, which basically reveres the South and the Confederacy. And I felt like some of my ancestors had been very active in promoting that. So that's when I decided to take this box out of the closet and look at what was in there.
Can't find my unmute. Thanks. And so in the course of both of you doing these separate researches into your families without being aware of the connection, you started going to a site called Afrogenius, which is a website dedicated to African American genealogy and the history of Africans in the Americas. So through this site, coming from it from each of your sides, you found each other in a very amazing story. Can you both explain to us how that came about and where that meeting led to?
Well, let me just say, actually, what was on the screen was a photograph of my great grandfather's History of Alabama, the version that I inherited, this kind of moldy 2-volume, was just republished in an annotated version, which is right there. And it does not talk about slavery. It kind of ends before the plantation period of Alabama. But I wanted to know, I basically typed A.J. Pickett's name into Google, and I ended up at Afrogenius, and I found there a note that Karen had posted saying, anyone who has any information on a planter in Alabama named Pickett, I'd be very interested. And I just wrote to her and said, that was my great-great-grandfather. So that was the beginning. You remember the date, Karen?
I do not, but
2 years ago.
probably May or June of 2018. Yeah.
Yeah, it was 2 years ago.
Yeah. And then from my view, I posted a query on Afrogenius because Afrogenius was very helpful in the beginning stages of researching Milton Howard's enslaved life. For example, the Afrogenius administrators gave me instructions on how to order Milton Howard's pension file from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And my friend Ann Banks saw one of my Afrogenius queries and contacted me. In her initial email, Ann said that she was a member of an organization called Coming to the Table, and she was involved with a project as part of being a member. Then roughly 6 months later, Ann emailed that she was planning to visit Montgomery, Alabama to conduct research for a story that she was writing. Ann's ancestor, Albert James Pickett, was who I thought may have enslaved my great-grandfather, Milton Howard. And I thought to myself that visiting Montgomery with Ann would just be the perfect opportunity for me to see if I could prove or disprove that A.J. Pickett was one of Milton's enslavers. It was indeed a calculated risk. Ann and I had compared DNA tests and determined we weren't even related. I had never met Ann in person and had only communicated online, but it was a risk I knew I had to take. I then made plans to meet my friend Ann in Montgomery, which included planning to meet other relatives who lived nearby.
Thank you. And Karen, just for everybody, can you explain sort of the backstory of Milton Howard, that he was actually a freeborn man or child born in Iowa who was then enslaved, captured, kidnapped, and brought to Alabama? Can you tell that story to us a little bit?
Yes, Milton Howard was born about 1851 in Muscatine County, Iowa. He was born a free person of color. He had a mother, a father, and likely several siblings. When he was just a baby, less than 2 years old, Milton and his family were kidnapped from their home in Muscatine County, Iowa, taken south and sold to Ann's ancestor. So he was there from about less than 2 years old until 1858, when Pickett died. Pickett died in 1858, Ann's ancestor, and Milton was sold away from his family to another planter named Howard, from which he took his surname. At that time, in 1858, he was about 7 years old. And then when the Civil War broke out in 1861, 3 years later, when he was about 9 or 10, a group of them ran off from the Howard plantation. And Milton himself was escorted back to Iowa by a Union soldier. And that's where he's been. That's where he was in Iowa until he died in 18th of March, 1928.
Wow. And the story of Milton's kidnapping and his life in Alabama has been a family history, a family oral history for your family passed down, and you were looking to enhance that story and to really find where he was. Is that what led you to go to Alabama with Ann?
That's correct. We had sketchy details. We were told that he was a house servant. We were told that, and which is true, that he learned to speak French, that the Picketts taught him to speak French, and that he was with his family up until 1858, which was a blessing, but not much else. We knew a last name, we knew some sketchy details, but not much else.
And Ann, when you decided to go to Alabama, what was it that you were really looking for? And how did you think this connection with Karen was going to enhance that? Or what difficulties or good experiences were you looking for?
Well, I want to say first that this kidnapping, it was called the Reverse Underground Railroad, and it was not at all a rare occurrence during this period. I think hundreds of thousands of free Blacks were kidnapped in the North and brought down the river, as they called it, and sold into slavery. In my case, because I was sort of lurking on Afrogenius, I had read that descendants of slaveholders were often valued for the information they might have, so that the descendants of slaves could have a better chance of tracing their ancestors. So when I first wrote to Karen, I think Karen was hoping, she said, can you just look through these files and see what you have that might help me in my search, and, you know, really just anything. And I looked and there really wasn't anything. And I felt bad writing to Karen and saying, you know, I don't think I have anything, but so I understand if you don't want to write to me anymore, but she did. So we kept on writing to each other for 6 months. I think every couple of days we wrote a lot. And then in terms of going to Alabama, I honestly kind of got the sense that Karen wanted to go. And when I kind of floated this idea, she just jumped on it. And so we made this plan, and it was kind of like signing up for a week-long blind date. I think we were both pretty brave to do it. We met in the airport in Charlotte, and I was a little nervous. Karen gave me a big hug, and then everything was okay for that time. And I was just so incredibly happy to be able to go to the archives with Karen and to do this. It was just a sense of kind of completion. I didn't have any of my own goal necessarily the way Karen did. She had something very specific that she wanted. She wanted to document, she wanted some evidence that Milton had been there. And the fact that we found it was really incredible. So Karen, you should tell that part of the story.
Yes, and we should say also that the A.J. Pickett's home, his plantation home, is no longer there. So there was no physical place for you to actually visit where Milton and Pickett had both lived. Is that right?
Well, the plantations were gone. There was a house that Pickett had built, but he died before he ever moved in. But we think that Milton probably had been there, right, Karen?
Right.
And
He could have been. Yeah, he could have been. Although it was in the city. So that
town, yeah.
makes me think that maybe not. I believe he probably his home was in the county, in Montgomery County somewhere.
Right. Okay. And so when you started
at Cedar Grove, not Cedar Grove, but what was the one he inherited from Sarah?
Our place that we went was the probate archives.
Okay.
I mean, Karen was very focused. She knew exactly where to go and what she was looking for, and the hours it was open, and and that's where we went. We weren't going around looking at historic houses. I mean, we did drive out to where the plantations had been, and we took a picture of ourselves in front of the historical marker, but we were looking in the archives.
Right. Right. And tell us what you found there, Karen.
Well, Ann and I arrived in Montgomery on Sunday, the 15th of October, 2018. We had made plans to visit the Montgomery County Probate Office on Monday, which was the next day. And then after researching the entire day on Monday, at the end, all we really had was a list of deeds. So about 3 p.m., Ann and I took a break to tour the nearby 5 Pickett house where Ann's ancestors had lived. It was now 4 in the afternoon and the probate office closed at 5 o'clock. Ann declined to return to the probate office to conduct more research, but I felt I had to return to review our list of deeds. After all, we were only going to be in Montgomery 1 week. It was this 1 hour window when I located Pickett's deed trust document that named my ancestor Milton. It was painful to discover that my great-grandfather, Milton Howard, was enslaved at 2 years old, but it was also a joyous occasion to realize that Ann's ancestor, Albert James Pickett, was the same Pickett that my father was talking about in the 1977 Rock Island Arsenal Target newsletter story. I verified with the head of the Montgomery County Probate Office, Dallas Hansberry, that this was my Milton and quickly made copies of the document. I then emailed a copy to Ann, and I was so excited that my first transcription of the document had several typographical errors.
That's amazing. And the document from the slide that we're seeing is actually the actual document where Milton name is listed.
And the reason that he and these others were put into trust, this was not uncommon in the South at this time. And it was for the same reasons people put anything to trust, like you want to keep it away from the son-in-law or whatever. But the trust was in favor of A.J. Pickett's wife. So the people in this trust were technically no longer owned by a Pickett. They were owned by a judge named Graham, which is one of the reasons that Karen was unable to locate Milton's name, because he wasn't in any of the slave inventories. Fortunately, he had a very unusual name. I mean, so once we found this Milton, we knew who that was. But this is the actual trust document that Karen found.
Wow, it's incredible. And so this story that the two of you were sharing about Milton A.J. Pickett, this is a story about a particular place and a particular time. And Karen finding this document really put proof in a tangible way to these stories that had passed down from her family and from Milton. And that's a rare occurrence, but an amazing occurrence as well. There's also some material culture artifacts that the two of you have come across that also connect your families. And can you talk about that? And I think maybe it's in the next slide. And can you talk about what the spoons represent?
Well, these are a couple of engraved serving spoons that I had in my silverware drawer, just right in the kitchen. And they were engraved, and I didn't really know who. I just had this kind of vague sense that these were ancestors. So one day I went out and my husband just looked up. One of them was L.P. Walker to Eliza, and he looked up L.P. Walker, and it turns out this was Leroy Pope Walker, who was the first Secretary of War of the Confederacy. And I had no idea about that. Anyway, at some point, I thought these spoons should belong to Karen because her great grandfather might have polished them. So she now has one of them. You want to tell about what happened, Karen?
Well, one day a relative was cleaning out the garage when she came across an old end table, and it was covered in layers of green paint and black lacquer. She telephoned me to come and take a look at it. I took the end table home and put it in my shed outside because it had a terrible odor. I could see that I didn't know exactly what it was. It was old and could stand and to be refinished, but outside of that, I really didn't know what it was. Several weeks later, Anne emailed me that she wanted to give me an engraved serving spoon that she had inherited from her family. Actually, she said she wanted to give them both to me and I wouldn't take both of them. I just said, save one for her granddaughter. I would take one, but to save one for her granddaughter. So this spoon possibly dates back to the 1830s. I had read a story online about Anne's ancestors, the Picketts, hiding their silver from Union soldiers in the chimney. I also read that this was a common practice during the Civil War. I then realized that that old end table in my outdoor shed was possibly a silver chest. I got the old end table refinished, and the restorer told me it was a mahogany buffet silver chest and dated the piece to the late 1890s. It almost certainly belonged to my ancestors, my great-grandfather Milton Howard and my great-grandmother Lena Smith Howard. Now the Howard family can add to their collection a silver chest to store the silver serving spoon that my friend Anne gave me.
Oh, that's amazing that this artifact connects the two of you. So when you did this trip, and were you already thinking about writing the story for Smithsonian, or just writing the story? And how did that lead to your creating your website, Confederates in the Closet?
Well, I definitely did want to write about it. As Karen said, I'm a member of Coming to the Table, which is a wonderful organization that brings together descendants of slaves and descendants of slaveholders. And they have a whole section of people who are kind of writing their stories. Confederates My Closet, the website, I have a whole pile of documents that were in my closet. And so, I would just pull out one of them and do research until it led to a story. And the idea really was to try to kind of undermine this whole lost cause myth. So
Mhm.
I take these ancestors and I kind of try to write about what the context really was. So that's kind of what I've been doing.
Great. And Karen, where has this, having found Milton in these records in Alabama, that have enriched your story and sort of proven the oral history passed down through your family, what's next for you? And are you continuing to use other websites to help in some of your searches?
Well, what's next for me? Anne sold her story about our shared history to the Smithsonian, who published it in September 2020. And out of that, I think a local reporter from my local newspaper called me and interviewed me for a story that he wrote about Milton Howard that appeared in his publication in November of 2020. Additionally, Anne was generous enough to share with me 1/2 of the proceeds that she received from selling her story to the Smithsonian. I, in turn, used my portion of the proceeds to purchase replacement grave markers for 8 of Milton Howard's children and grandchildren who died as children. Eventually, I would like to write and publish a 3-generation genealogy of the Milton Howard family. Milton was married 4 to 5 times, so I feel it's very important not only for my relatives to know who the members of each family were, but also other researchers and the general public. Also, Anne and I have been discussing meeting again in Montgomery sometime in the future to conduct more research and visit relatives.
Right. Well, you two started this research in 2018, and your involvement was really in sort of reaction to what was happening politically post the election of 2016. Now, fast forward, here we are in 2020, and the events of this summer with the Black Lives Matter movement after the killing of George Floyd. This kind of interest in this type of genealogy and family research and uncovering the stories of not only the enslaved people of the whole United States, but of also of those families who were enslavers, has become something that's in the forefront of conversation and of interest. What kind of advice would you give to people who are just starting this journey? And how do you think that doing this research really is a reflection of what's happening today, and how learning these histories adds to our understanding of where we are and where we want to be going?
Well, people ask me, well, first of all, I think the most important thing that I did was to join Coming to the Table, because it kind of gave me a framework and moral support and encouragement. People ask me how I felt, when I learned this about this family history of slaveholding. And the way I feel is I'm really glad that I know, because otherwise, you're just kind of in some denial about what the history of this country really is. And in my case, because this is the history of my family, it just jolted me onto a fast track to really learn much more history. And I'm very happy that I know it. And I think everyone should.